Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 10th of December. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First, we're going to start with Kupiansk-Liman front line from this area. These two front lines are stable. The Russians reported that they continue doing some counter-offensive steps on the Liman front line in the direction of Zarechno. They're trying to develop and to push the Ukrainians from this position. They're trying to return control over the areas around Chervona Popovka, and the Russians tries to return control over the territory around Plashanka. And according to the report, the Russians are saying that they managed to achieve some success. If we're talking about the progress, about the numbers, the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost around 60 soldiers and something around 3 armored vehicles in this area. But to tell the truth, if you ask me, I must say that I see that maybe the Russians have some progress, but it's not like the thing that you're doing that you want to achieve. Maybe the Ukrainians just understood that it is highly unlikely that they will be able to develop or do something these days near Kreminna, so that's why the Ukrainians are stepping back on Zhiribets River, and maybe the Ukrainians decided during the winter period to establish some kind of front line along this river, because it is much easier to defend this and protect this area than to try to achieve some success on this bank of the river, because this is exactly in front of Russian forces. They have a better logistic, they have bridges, they have everything they need. And we're talking about the Ukrainians, the closest town where the Ukrainians are able to have some supply and support is Slaviansk, and it's not an easy job to cross at least 3 rivers like Seversky Donets and then to get everything they need on these front lines. So Liman, as we know, is already dead city. I believe that there are a lot of people, but I'm sure that there are no job there. That people who lives there, I'm not sure that they are able to support and to help the Ukrainian forces on these front lines. So I believe that Ukrainians are stepping back, but very slowly. So if the Russians attack, then they're stepping back. If the Russians don't attack, that means that there is no need to step back. If we're talking about Kupiansk front line, as you can see, according to the Western sources map, there are a lot of icons of artillery attack. The Russians attacked the Ukrainians while they were planning to accumulate their forces for another attempt of counter-offensive operation in this area, but the Russians attacked the concentration of Ukrainian forces, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 30 soldiers and something around 3 armored vehicles. If we're talking about this area, we are talking about the same towns like Berestovo and Novoselovskaya. On the north, Kislovka, Kotlarovka, so the same towns. There are no updates, as you can see. The Russians reported, and some Russian sources are saying that during the previous 2 weeks, if we're talking about this area, mainly this area field is concentrated with the Russian mobilized forces, not the professional army, not the contract army, but just with mobilized forces. This is not the main area for the Ukrainian attack. This is like the secondary direction. If it's possible to achieve some success, of course the Ukrainians would be glad. But from the other side, they understand that they don't want to concentrate their main forces to push this area. Only if they want to achieve some media victory, yes, they can use this area for media victory. But we understand that if we're talking about media victory, this media victory on the secondary front line may cause a lot of damage for the Ukrainians, so that's why they're keeping their not very important forces. From this perspective, the Russians are able to keep some mobilized forces and to give them some time, to give them some war experience. And of course it's very dangerous to be there, but it's less dangerous to be there than, let's say, to be near Donetsk or near Bakhmut. So we can say that the north of LPR is some kind of very perfect military training center for the Russians' mobilized forces. For those who are ready to be deployed on the territory of Ukraine special military operation, but who are not ready to be deployed, let's say, near Donetsk or near Bakhmut. So first they need to pass some kind of to achieve some kind of military experience of the real war, of the real clashes, but not near Bakhmut, because some Western countries try to calculate the average life cycle of mobilized soldiers who were deployed near Bakhmut, near Donetsk during the first weeks of mobilization. If you remember, on the 20th of September, the Russians announced about the mobilization process, about the 300,000 soldiers, but some of those mobilized forces were deployed at the front lines during the next 2 weeks. So most of the mobilized forces were deployed or are deploying right now. So after months of trainings, not like the next week, but some force at that period of time when the situation was critical, the Russians were forced to deploy some force during the next few weeks. So some Western countries some sources tried to calculate the average lifetime cycle of those forces. So they gave a number of 21 days. So as from the moment when those first wave of mobilized forces, soldiers were mobilized, past 21 days, and after that they were found dead somewhere on the front line. So as you can see, it was a very big mistake of the Russians during the first mobilized week. So that's why they decided first to dive these forces deeper in the situation very slowly, step by step. And the north of LPR is the best bridgehead, the best place to do this, because if we're talking Zaporozhye, Kherson region, there are no clashes there. There is a river, Dnipro River. I believe it's highly unlikely that Ukrainians will try to cross this river, and the Russians are not going to do this thing as well. If we're talking about Orekhov, Gulyai Polye, I'm not sure that there are a lot of forces there, but I'm not sure that the Russians are planning to keep mobilized forces untrained and experienced, because if we're talking about the Ukrainians, near Orekhov, Gulyai Polye, Zaporozhye, Dnipro, there are a lot of forces who passed, and a lot of clashes, a lot of battles for Kherson, battles for Kupiansk, for Kharkiv. So they're very experienced. So that's why the Russians are forced to keep almost the same, the forces of the same level of experience. If we're talking about Donetsk and Bakhmut, it's a suicide operation zones. So to start the mobilization story of mobilized force from these two towns, it's like the waste of mobilized resource. But Kupiansk front line, Liman, is the best solution in this case, and the Russians are saying that most of the forces in this area are the mobilized resource, the Russian mobilized resource. Now if we're talking about Kupiansk and Liman, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost around 90 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. So as you can see, not much, just regular artillery duels, maybe some kind of lucky strikes, lucky attacks, and nothing more. If we are talking about Belogorovka, Seversk, Charlie Group line, there are no changes in this area. These days we were saying that Ukrainians started some kind of retreating process from Solidar, but as you can see, the front lines are still stable. The Ukrainians moved some battalions, mechanized battalions of the 93rd Brigade. I believe that the next days on deployment map, we're going to see some updates about new forces who were deployed there from the Ukrainian side. If we're talking about Charlie Group line, we see that these towns like Yakovlevka, Belogorovka on the Russian sources map still, let's say, in the gray zone. The Russians are not updating this map. I believe that soon they're going to do this, but for now, I believe that there are still chances from Ukrainian side to return control over these towns. So let's wait a little bit and we'll see. If we're talking about Bakhmut, about this area, as you can see, there are no changes. There's just a few updates on the Russian sources map, maybe about these industrial zones, about the south of Opytne, about like the border along these water arcade, but nothing more. There are heavy clashes there. We are seeing more and more updates about the situation, but as you can see, the front lines are stable. Even if the Ukrainians have losses, they move more reserves, and the Ukrainians still have a lot of reserves for these purposes. They are ready to lose another 10 or 20 or 30,000 soldiers, but the Ukrainians understand that almost the same amount of soldiers the Russians will lose as well. maybe less, maybe even more, but it's some kind of fair trade from, as you understand, the Ukrainians understand that this might be some kind of fair trade, if we're talking, if we can call this situation fair, or these clashes as some kind of trade. If we're talking about Toretsk, New York agglomeration, there are no changes in this area, as you can see, even no icons, so that means the front lines are completely stable. Just heavy clashes on triangle between Shumy, Mayorsk, Druzhba in this area. Both parties are trying to stress their enemy to understand they find a weak position, but nothing more. Everybody are trying to save and keep their soldiers alive. If we are talking about Avdiivka, Donetsk, Pesky front line, as you can see, this is the most hot point on the Ukrainian special operation. Donetsk is under very heavy fire, as we saw this picture yesterday. Before yesterday, the Ukrainians attacked and bombed Donetsk, the central part, the part where we can find the biggest number of civilians and so on. So it's very difficult. As you know, the Russians were trying to raise this question on the Soviet of United Nations Organization, but they got an answer that the United Nations Organization can't confirm that these attacks comes from the territory of Ukraine. So they're saying that maybe the Russians are attacking themselves. So something like this, and as you can see, the Russians understand that they won't be able to achieve some answers from the Western countries. They are not able to force the Ukrainians to stop attack Donetsk. And this is the double standard situation. If we're talking about Avdiivka frontline, about this area, these days the Russians reported and they show the town the Ukrainians uses to attack the middle part of Donetsk. And today the Russians show that Ukrainians uses Toninka, this small village that located on the south from Orlovka, on the north from Pesky frontline, and the Ukrainians uses these positions to attack the middle part of Donetsk. As you can see, the distance between these areas around 20 kilometers, so the Ukrainians are able to use missiles, regular artillery, and something like this. So we understand that there are not much places that Ukrainians are able to use to attack Donetsk and to terrorize their civilians. First of all, it's let's just take a look at this map and we'll find that it's Toninka, one of the places that Ukrainians uses to do this. The Ukrainians used to use Nivolsk, I believe, but as soon as the Russians got as close as possible to this town, now they don't have such possibilities. The Ukrainians uses Krasnogorovka for these purposes, and the Ukrainians uses Marinka, or let's say like the west part of Marinka. So there are at least 4 points that the Russians need to take control over, and the situation with Donetsk will be solved. Of course, there are some places in Avdiivka that Ukrainians uses for these purposes, but I'm not sure I understand where exactly the Ukrainians deploy their artillery to attack Donetsk. As you can see, all these 4 positions, or maybe 5, are very close to Donetsk, but every single square meter the Russians need to pass before get these towns, they need to waste maybe hundreds or thousands of their soldiers, because it's very difficult. The battle for Donetsk is, I believe, is very difficult situation, and the progress are very slow in this area, and the Russians loses their soldiers. Even if we see that they have some progress near Opytne, Vodyane, Nivolsk, we see some progress. Sometimes we see that the Russians are able to break the situation, but we need to understand that even this small area around Donetsk, on Pesky, Opytne, I believe that this area cost the Russians maybe the lives of thousands of soldiers. Thousands of soldiers were killed during this operation to liberate this territory and to push the Ukrainian artillery positions as far as possible from this area. If we're talking about Donetsk front line, I'm talking about the line between Bakhmut and Donetsk. The Ukrainians lost around 50 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. We haven't received any updates from Marinka. I believe that there are still heavy clashes. Just the Russians were saying that Ukrainians sent some forces, some reserves to hold the positions in the central part of Marinka. And as you can see, I believe that they managed to do this. No progress from the Russian side in this area, so let's follow this situation. If we're talking about Ugledar front line, these days the Ukrainians sent, these previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians sent some commandos to check the situation near Shevchenko and near Solotka, these towns, but the Russians spotted those commandos and they attacked them. And as a result of clashes during these previous 24 hours near Ugledar, the Ukraine lost around 40 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. So this situation on the ground, and as I told you a few days ago, I'm not sure that the next few weeks we are going to see a lot of updates on the map, because both sides are ready to fight, both sides are not ready to give up, both sides are not ready to step back. Everybody has reserves, everybody has forces, and everybody has a wish to fight and to win the battles. But anyway, in 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to see there going to be some breaking point, and after that, we might see some movements on the front line. If we're talking about the Russians, the main thing that they need to achieve during the next 3 weeks is to save as much as possible of their soldiers and to reduce as much as possible the Ukrainians. If we're talking about the Ukrainians, they need to, no matter their own losses, they need to deal as much as possible damage to the Russians. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.